Arthur drove Excalibur through Lancelot's chest, the blade glowing with an eerie light as it pierced through armor and flesh. "Even your rebellion dies like this," Arthur growled, stepping closer as Lancelot's blood pooled beneath him. Rain lashed against the cracked windows of the crumbling inn where Merlin sat, his cloak heavy with water. The dim fire in the hearth did little to warm the room, its glow flickering across the weary faces of the few travelers who dared to linger. Outside, the sound of armored boots striking cobblestones mixed with a low rumble of thunder. Camelot's knights, or what had become of them, patrolled the streets like wolves guarding a carcass. Merlin kept to the shadows, his staff resting across his knees. He traced the grooves in the wood with his fingers, feeling the wear of centuries. He had once carried this staff with pride, a symbol of wisdom and hope. Now, it was little more than a crutch for an old man, one step ahead of the gallows. A sharp knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. The innkeeper froze, his eyes darting toward the sound. Slowly, he crossed the room, his hand trembling as he lifted the latch. The door swung open, revealing a figure drenched in rain. The man stumbled inside, clutching his side. Blood seeped between his fingers, staining his tunic. Merlin stood immediately, his eyes narrowing. "Who sent you?" Merlin asked, his voice low but sharp. The man collapsed onto a nearby stool, gasping for breath. "The Queen," he managed to say. "She's alive, but imprisoned." Merlin stepped forward, gripping the man's shoulder. "Where is she?" "The castle," the messenger said. "Arthur. He's keeping her as leverage." "Lancelot. He's in the northern woods, waiting for you." The man's head lolled to the side, his body going limp. Merlin caught him before he fell to the floor, lowering him gently. The innkeeper moved closer, his face pale. "What will you do?" the innkeeper whispered. Merlin straightened, his eyes hard. "What I should have done years ago." The northern woods were vast and unyielding, a maze of gnarled roots and twisting paths obscured by the dense fog. The remnants of Camelot's loyal knights made their camp deep within its cover, where Arthur's patrols dared not venture. The forest whispered with the rustling of leaves and the distant calls of nocturnal creatures. It was a place of ghosts and shadows, but for Lancelot and his men, it was the only refuge. The camp sprawled across a small clearing, its perimeter guarded by makeshift barricades of sharpened stakes and bramble. A handful of fires burned low, their embers casting flickering light on the tired faces of the knights. Their armor, once polished to a brilliant shine, was dented and dull. Tabards bearing the crest of Camelot were tattered, the once proud symbol now a haunting reminder of the kingdom they had lost. Lancelot sat at the center of the camp, his back to an ancient oak. His sword lay across his lap, its edge gleaming faintly even in the dim light. He ran a whetstone along the blade with slow, deliberate strokes. The rhythm of the task steadied him, kept his thoughts from spiraling into doubt. A young knight approached, his footsteps hesitant. The boy, no older than 16, stood awkwardly, his helm tucked under his arm. Lancelot glanced up, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Speak," Lancelot said, his voice low but firm. The boy swallowed hard. "The men, they're uneasy, sir. They wonder if Merlin will truly come, if we can trust him." Lancelot let out a slow breath, setting the whetstone aside. "Do they doubt Merlin? Or do they doubt me?" The boy's cheeks flushed, and he looked down. "It's not that, sir. They believe in you. It's just Merlin's been gone so long. Some think he's abandoned us." Lancelot stood, the movement swift and fluid despite the weight of his armor. He loomed over the boy, his expression unreadable. "Merlin hasn't abandoned us. He's been fighting in his own way from the shadows. Without him, most of us wouldn't still be alive." The boy nodded quickly, his hands tightening around the edge of his helm. "Yes, sir. I'll tell them." "Good," Lancelot said, his tone final. As the boy hurried off, Lancelot sighed and turned his gaze to the distant treetops. The moon was a faint sliver in the sky, its light barely penetrating the canopy. He couldn't blame the men for their doubts. The months of hiding and skirmishing had taken their toll. Supplies were dwindling, and every raid came with a cost in blood. Still brooding, I see. The voice startled him, though he didn't show it. Turning, Lancelot saw a familiar figure emerging from the shadows. Percival, one of the few knights who had stood by him since the beginning, grinned as he approached. Brooding keeps me sharp, Lancelot said, a faint smile tugging at his lips. Percival chuckled, slinging a water skin over his shoulder. You do better to get some sleep. We've got enough men doubting our chances without you looking like a ghost. I'll sleep when this is over, Lancelot replied, his gaze hardening. Percival's grin faded. If it ever is. Before Lancelot could respond, a commotion at the edge of the camp drew their attention. Voices rose, a mix of alarm and confusion. Lancelot's hand went to his sword as he strode toward the source of the noise. The knights had gathered near the barricades, their weapons drawn. In the shadows beyond the firelight, a figure approached. Lancelot raised a hand, signaling his men to hold. Show yourself, he called. The figure stepped forward, and gasps rippled through the group. Merlin stood before them, his robes soaked from the rain, his staff glowing faintly at its tip. He looked older than Lancelot remembered, his face lined with exhaustion, but his eyes burned with the same fierce intelligence. Is this how you greet an old friend? Merlin said, his voice carrying a hint of amusement despite his weariness. Lancelot sheathed his sword and stepped forward. The two men clasped hands, a gesture heavy with unspoken words. You're late, Lancelot said, his tone teasing but edged with relief. Merlin smirked. I had a few distractions. Arthur's men are more persistent than I gave them credit for. Lancelot gestured for Merlin to follow him to the center of the camp. The knights parted, their murmurs fading as they watched the old wizard with a mixture of awe and skepticism. When they reached the clearing, Merlin sank onto a log near the fire, his movements slow and deliberate. Lancelot waited for him to speak, sensing the weight of what was coming. Arthur knows you're out here, Merlin said finally, his voice low. He's growing more paranoid by the day. His patrols are doubling, and he's begun executing anyone he suspects of helping you. Lancelot's jaw tightened. Then we need to strike soon. Merlin nodded. Yes, but you need to understand something. This won't be a battle like any you've fought before. Excalibur has changed him. The sword is no longer just a weapon. It's a conduit for something darker. It feeds on his anger, his fear. The man we knew as Arthur is gone. The fire crackled between them, its light casting long shadows on their faces. Lancelot stared into the flames, his expression grim. Then we kill what he's become, he said. Merlin's gaze softened. It won't be that simple. The sword binds him to the throne. Even if you defeat him, Camelot may fall with him. Are you prepared for that? Lancelot didn't answer immediately. He looked around the camp, at the tired faces of the knights who had followed him into exile, at the frayed banners that once symbolized hope. We've already lost Camelot, he said finally. All that's left is to make sure Arthur doesn't destroy what little remains. Merlin leaned back, his expression unreadable. Then we'd better get started. The two men spent the rest of the night poring over maps and strategies, their voices low but urgent. Around them, the camp settled into uneasy rest, the knights knowing that the time for hiding was nearly over. The map stretched across the rough wooden table, its edges frayed from years of use. Dark ink marked the walls, gates, and towers of Camelot, each line a reminder of the fortress's near-impenetrable defenses. A lantern swayed gently overhead, casting shifting shadows over the gathered group. Around the table, Lancelot, Merlin, and a dozen of the most trusted knights studied the layout in tense silence. Merlin leaned over the table, his gnarled finger tracing a line along the outer wall. Here, he said, the western gate. The guards are fewer at night, and the defenses are weaker. The gate mechanism itself is old, vulnerable. With the right tools, we can breach it without raising the alarm, if we're quick. Too narrow, a grizzled knight growled. Sir Bedivere, his face scarred from a dozen battles, shook his head. If the alarm sounds, we'll be bottlenecked before we even make it through. Lancelot tapped the map with the hilt of his dagger. We don't have another choice. The eastern approach is exposed, and the southern gate is reinforced. The western gate is our best shot." Bedivere scowled, but said nothing more. Lancelot turned his gaze to Merlin. "And the inner defenses?" Merlin straightened, his face grim. "Stronger. The throne room is heavily guarded at all hours." Arthur's paranoia grows by the day. He's stationed men along the corridors leading to the Great Hall, and the knights who still follow him are utterly loyal or too afraid to cross him. "What about Guinevere?" Lancelot asked, his voice tight. Merlin hesitated, his eyes flicking to the map. "She's being held in the North Tower. He's using her as leverage, knowing you'd come for her. Reaching her will take time, and splitting our forces." A murmur rippled through the knights. Splitting their already meager numbers seemed like suicide. "We'll need 2 teams, Lancelot said, cutting through the noise. "One to breach the western gate and secure the path to the throne room. The other to reach the tower and free the queen." "And if one team fails?" Bedivere asked, his voice low. Lancelot met his gaze without flinching. "Then the other finishes the mission. We all knew the risks when we chose this fight." The room fell silent. The men exchanged grim looks, their faces lit by the wavering lantern light. These were knights who had fought alongside Lancelot for years, who had survived Arthur's wrath and the slow unraveling of Camelot. They knew the weight of what they were about to attempt. Merlin broke the silence. "There's something else you need to know. Excalibur isn't just a sword anymore. It's alive in a way. It draws strength from Arthur, but it also feeds on him. The closer you get to him, the more it will resist you." "What does that mean?" asked Sir Gawain, his brow furrowed. "It means it won't be enough to simply overpower Arthur," Merlin said. "You'll need to disarm him, separate him from the sword. Without it, he's vulnerable. But as long as he wields it, he's nearly unstoppable." Lancelot's hand tightened on the hilt of his dagger. "Then we take the sword from him, whatever it takes." Merlin nodded, though his expression remained troubled. "Just remember, Excalibur is cunning. It will protect itself. Don't underestimate it." The knights began murmuring among themselves, debating logistics, voicing concerns. Lancelot let them speak for a moment, then raised his hand. The room fell silent again. "We've waited long enough," he said. "Arthur's rule has turned Camelot into a nightmare. Every day we delay, more innocent lives are lost. We strike tomorrow night. Prepare your men, sharpen your blades, and say whatever prayers you still believe in. This is our only chance." The knights murmured their agreement, their faces set with grim determination. Bedivere was the last to nod, though his eyes betrayed his lingering doubts. As the others dispersed to ready themselves, Lancelot and Merlin remained by the map. Merlin placed a hand on Lancelot's shoulder, his grip firm. "Arthur was your friend once," Merlin said quietly. "Killing him, it won't be easy." Lancelot's expression hardened. "The man I knew is gone. What's left of him died the day he chose that sword over his people." Merlin said nothing. He turned back to the map, tracing the path they would take through the castle. His fingers lingered on the throne room, where he knew their fates would be decided. The camp was unusually quiet as the knights prepared for battle. Armor was polished, weapons sharpened, and packs filled with what little provisions they could carry. Men spoke in hushed tones, their voices heavy with the weight of what lay ahead. Lancelot moved through the camp, stopping to speak with each knight. He offered words of encouragement where he could, but mostly he listened. He listened to their fears, their doubts, and their quiet determination. When he reached Merlin's tent, he found the old wizard hunched over a collection of scrolls, his staff leaning against the canvas wall. The faint glow from the staff bathed the tent in an eerie light. "Still studying?" Lancelot asked, stepping inside. "Always," Merlin replied without looking up. "You never know when the smallest detail might save a life." Lancelot sat across from him, his hands resting on his knees. "Do you think we'll succeed?" Merlin looked up, his eyes piercing. "I think you'll do what must be done. Whether that's success, well, history will decide." Lancelot nodded, though Merlin's words offered little comfort. He stood and turned to leave, but paused at the entrance. "If I fall tomorrow, make sure the queen gets out. She's the one who can rebuild this kingdom." "You're not going to fall," Merlin said firmly. "Not if I have anything to say about it." Lancelot didn't reply. He stepped into the cool night air, the distant sounds of the forest filling the silence. He looked toward the darkened horizon, where Camelot's towers loomed like jagged teeth against the sky. Tomorrow it would all end, one way or another. The night of the assault was moonless, the forest shrouded in heavy mist. The knights moved through the underbrush with practiced silence, their breaths steady despite the tension knotting their stomachs. Each man carried his sword strapped to his side, his steps deliberate. In the distance, the jagged towers of Camelot pierced the night sky, their outlines barely visible through the haze. Lancelot led the column, his grip firm on the hilt of his blade. Behind him, Bedivere and the others followed, their armor muffled with strips of cloth to silence their movement. Merlin walked near the rear, his staff glowing faintly, casting just enough light to keep them from losing their way. When they reached the outer wall, Lancelot raised a hand, signaling for the group to halt. The western gate loomed ahead, its iron bound would slick with rain. Two guards stood just inside the portcullis, their torches burning low. "Positions," Lancelot whispered, his voice barely audible. The knights dispersed into the shadows, taking their places along the wall. Sir Percival crept forward, carrying a coil of rope fitted with a grappling hook. He crouched low, his movements precise, and swung the hook upward. It latched onto the edge of the wall with a faint clink. Percival tugged the rope twice, testing its hold, then began to climb. His ascent was slow but steady, his boots finding purchase on the slick stone. When he reached the top, he drew his dagger and crept along the parapet toward the nearest guard. The man turned just as Percival struck, the blade slicing cleanly across his throat. The guard fell soundlessly, his torch clattering to the stones. With the first guard down, the others began their climb. Within minutes, the knights had taken the wall, dispatching the remaining sentries with ruthless efficiency. Lancelot signaled for the rest of the group to follow, and the knights poured through the now unlocked gate. Inside, the castle was eerily quiet. The main courtyard stretched before them, its cobblestones glistening with rain. Lancelot motioned for the group to split into two teams. Bedivere would lead one group toward the north tower to rescue Guinevere, while Lancelot, Merlin, and the rest would head for the throne room. "Remember," Lancelot said, addressing both groups, "we move quickly and quietly. Non necessary risks. If you're cornered, hold your ground and wait for reinforcements. This only works if we trust each other." The knights nodded, their faces grim. Bedivere clasped Lancelot's forearm briefly before leading his team into the shadows. Lancelot watched them go, his chest tight. He had known many of these men for years, and he wasn't sure how many would make it back. Lancelot's group moved swiftly through the castle's lower corridors, their footsteps muffled on the damp stone. The air grew heavier the closer they came to the throne room, the faint hum of Excalibur's power vibrating in the walls. Merlin walked beside Lancelot, his staff held before him like a lantern warding off the darkness. "The sword knows we're here," Merlin murmured. "It's warning him." "Let it," Lancelot said, his voice hard. "We'll face him either way." They rounded a corner and stopped abruptly. Ahead, a group of Arthur's knights stood in formation, their shields raised. At their head was Sir Agravain, one of Arthur's most loyal followers. His face twisted into a sneer when he saw Lancelot. "Traitor," Agravain spat, stepping forward. "You dare bring your filth into the king's halls?" Lancelot drew his sword, the blade gleaming in the torchlight. "Step aside, Agravain. You don't have to die for him." Agravain laughed, the sound cold and sharp. "You think I fear death? I fight for my king, my true king." Before Lancelot could respond, Agravain raised his sword, and his men charged. The narrow corridor erupted into chaos. Swords clashed against shields, and the shouts of combatants echoed off the stone walls. Lancelot met Agravain head-on, their blades colliding in a shower of sparks. Agravain was strong, his strikes brutal and relentless, but Lancelot was faster. He sidestepped a heavy blow and brought his sword down, slicing through Agravain's leg. The man fell to one knee, his face contorted in pain. "It doesn't have to end like this," Lancelot said, his sword poised above Agravain's throat. Agravain snarled. "Long live the king," he hissed, lunging forward. Lancelot's blade flashed, and Agravain collapsed, his blood pooling on the stones. Behind him, the other knights were finishing off the last of Arthur's men. Merlin leaned against the wall, his breathing labored. His magic had flared briefly during the fight, stunning several enemies, but the effort had drained him. "Are you all right?" Lancelot asked, offering him a hand. Merlin nodded, though his face was pale. "We need to keep moving." Lancelot gestured for the others to follow, and they pressed on. The throne room was just ahead. Meanwhile, Bedivere's group scaled the narrow staircase leading to the North Tower. The climb was treacherous, the stone steps worn smooth from centuries of use. The tower loomed above them, its narrow windows glowing faintly with torchlight. When they reached the top, they found 2 guards stationed outside the Queen's chamber. Bedivere motioned for his men to fan out, then stepped forward, his sword raised. The guards reacted quickly, drawing their weapons, but they were no match for the knights. The fight was brief, ending with the guards sprawled lifeless on the floor. Bedivere pushed open the chamber door and stepped inside. Guinevere stood by the window, her wrists bound with iron chains. Her face was pale, but her eyes blazed with defiance. "Sir Bedivere," she said, her voice steady despite the circumstances, "I was beginning to think you'd forgotten about me." "Never, my queen," Bedivere replied, crossing the room to free her. The chains fell away with a metallic clatter, and Guinevere rubbed her wrists, wincing. "Arthur won't let this stand," she said. "You know that." "We're counting on it," Bedivere replied. "Come, we have to get you out of here." Guinevere followed him to the door, but her gaze lingered on the distant silhouette of the throne room. "This isn't just about me," she said quietly. "This is about all of us." Bedivere placed a hand on her shoulder. "Lancelot will see it through. Trust him." As Lancelot's group approached the throne room, the faint hum of Excalibur grew louder, a pulsing rhythm that seemed to vibrate in their bones. The doors loomed before them, massive and foreboding. Lancelot placed a hand on the handle and turned to his men. "This is it," he said. "No turning back." Merlin stepped forward, his staff glowing brighter. "Be ready. The sword won't let this be easy." Lancelot pushed the doors open, and they stepped into the throne room. Arthur sat on the blackened throne, Excalibur resting across his lap. The blade glowed with an unnatural light, its edges pulsing like a heartbeat. "You've come far, Lancelot," Arthur said, his voice cold and mocking. "But it ends here." The stage was set. The final battle was about to begin. Arthur's strikes were relentless, each swing of Excalibur carrying a force that sent shockwaves through the air. Lancelot parried, his arms straining against the impact. Around them, the knights engaged Arthur's loyal guards, the hall erupting into chaos. Merlin moved through the fray, his staff weaving patterns of light as he cast protective wards over Lancelot's men. His magic flared brightly as he sent one of Arthur's knights sprawling with a blast of energy. "Focus on the sword," Merlin shouted to Lancelot. "You must separate him from it." Arthur's eyes flashed with fury. "Do you think I'll let you take it from me?" he growled, driving Lancelot back with a series of brutal swings. "Excalibur and I are one. You cannot break that bond." Lancelot ducked beneath a sweeping strike, his blade darting toward Arthur's exposed side. Arthur twisted, the edge of Excalibur meeting Lancelot's sword with a bone-rattling clang. "You've let the sword rule you, Arthur," Lancelot said, his voice strained. "It's not strength, it's weakness." Arthur roared, his anger driving him forward. Excalibur's glow intensified, filling the room with blinding light. Lancelot gritted his teeth, pushing back against the onslaught. Arthur lunged. Excalibur aimed for Lancelot's heart. Lancelot sidestepped, deflecting the blow, but the force sent him staggering. Arthur pressed the attack, his strikes growing wilder and more brutal. Merlin stood at the edge of the battle, his staff glowing brighter as he muttered an incantation under his breath. The air around him shimmered, the spell building in intensity. With a final word, Merlin raised his staff high, and a pulse of energy shot toward Arthur. The blast struck the king squarely in the chest, sending him staggering back. Excalibur's glow flickered, the connection between man and weapon momentarily disrupted. "Now, Lancelot!" Merlin shouted. Lancelot surged forward, his sword aimed not at Arthur, but at Excalibur. He brought the blade down with all his strength, striking the enchanted weapon. The impact was like a thunderclap. Excalibur shattered, its pieces scattering across the throne room in a burst of light. Arthur screamed, clutching his chest as if a part of him had been torn away. But the shattering released a surge of dark energy, a final retaliation from the sword. The force struck Lancelot, driving him to his knees. Blood seeped through the gaps in his armor, staining the stone floor beneath him. Arthur, weakened and disarmed, fell to his knees as well, his breath ragged. He looked up at Lancelot, his face a mix of rage and sorrow. "You've doomed us all," Arthur rasped. Lancelot, clutching his side, managed a weak smile. "No, Arthur, I freed us." He collapsed, Excalibur's final blow taking its toll. Blood pooled around him, spreading in a dark circle. The room fell silent, the echoes of the battle fading. The knights surrounded Lancelot's fallen form, their faces grim. Guinevere appeared in the doorway, her expression a mix of grief and resolve. She knelt beside Lancelot, her hand resting on his chest. "He gave everything," Merlin said quietly, his voice heavy with sorrow. "Camelot will remember him as a hero." Arthur, broken and defeated, was bound by the remaining knights. The pieces of Excalibur were gathered and sealed away, their power too dangerous to leave unchecked. As dawn broke over Camelot, the throne room stood silent. A battlefield turned into a grave. Lancelot's sacrifice had ended Arthur's reign, but the cost was etched into the blood-stained stone.